Hey, everybody, welcome to the podcast. Today I have author Aaron Lindsay. I'll see you on the other side. Yeah, the tinny sound is precisely what pandemic era podcasting mostly sounds like. So, um, how you doing? Are you productive during the pandemic? I feel like you probably are.
It is different now than it was before. I don't know if it's just that I'm just kind of getting used to it or what, but I would say the first, because we're now, what is it, 13 months or whatever, depending on where you are, into lockdown or semi-lockdown mode. And that first, I want to say 8 months or so, I couldn't really do much. I did, but it was a struggle. It was like sucking jello through a straw. It just trying to be creative, which is surprising. Like I really intuitively would have thought that, hey, this is a great time since I don't have a social life anyway to really knuckle down and get it done. But that might have just been that I was between projects. Like I had just wrapped Silver Shooter and I wasn't really feeling what I was working on at the time. And I started something completely different. And this is a very long answer, but more productive right now than I've been for years. I'm like fan fiction levels of productive right now. It's almost scary.
Yeah, have you ever heard of a French author named Celine? He
Just Celine?
well, that's what he publishes as. I'm sure he definitely has a longer name, but he's
No.
kind of a dick. He's been
I don't think I've read anything more recent than Camus, to be honest.
yeah. Well, I mean, he like inspired Bukowski and some of the other beat authors,
Okay.
but he's been sort of canceled because of his politics. And
Oh,
but
I
he
might have
had
heard of him. I might have read about him in The Economist.
yeah, but he once wrote about how he wishes Paris would just stop so he could catch up, so he could catch his breath. I
I felt
forget what
like that
the
about New York.
yeah, I don't remember the exact prose, but I always felt like that, especially after moving to New York years ago. And as soon as all my clients left town, and they really did, they were among the population that went to Florida or Texas.
Right.
um, I I just tackled all these dream projects I've been wanting to write but never had time to. Stuff going back 20 years in development. And I think the first 3 months was my most productive I've ever been in my
Hmm.
whole life. And then I kind of slowed down. And, but it was 3 months of just, I mean, even in my MFA, I didn't write as much as I wrote the first 3 months of the pandemic.
Hmm.
And it's an MFA in writing.
Go figure. And then meanwhile, I'm staring at all my paints sitting there, not painting, and staring at my guitar sitting unloved in the corner, getting dusted reliably every 2 weeks, and that's about it. And thinking, why am I not doing these things? Why,
Yeah.
when I found time to do them when I was busy, am I not doing them when I'm chewing my fingernails? Not literally, but figuratively sort of going stir crazy. And I don't have a satisfying answer for that, but it is what it is.
Yeah. Same. I have a guitar, I have a piano. I haven't opened them up since before probably last February. I don't know why. I wonder if it was just maybe we needed them to kind of cool off from the stresses of an average day, which no longer exist. It's a different kind of stress, I think.
Mm.
Um,
Looking back, I can't really. I mean, there was a period when I had a full-time job and a very high demand job at that. I was living in a very difficult part of the world, and I was writing 2 books a year. And I look back on that and think, how did I do that? How did I make that happen without going crazy? Or did I? Perhaps my mental health wasn't what I thought it was at the time. When you're in the eye of the storm, maybe you don't see it. But I'm exhausted after the fact, looking back at that and wondering how I did it.
yeah, uh, that's an interesting way to put it too. Being in the eye of the storm, you don't know that you're exhausted. Um,
Until you get sick when it's over.
yeah,
That's something that people in my old line of work, it happens all the time. You're in a really high stress environment and you wait for your home leave or your R&R to come along, and when the R&R comes along, you promptly get sick and you spend your entire R&R sick, and then it's time to go back to work because your body's like, oh, can we rest now? Awesome.
I've never been on a vacation where I just didn't stay in and nurse myself with a cup of tea. So, you know, I reached out to you because I wanted to talk about ghost stories, and you know how why I thought of you is our household discovered you at the beginning of the pandemic. The New York Public Library published on their blog an article of great literature to read during a pandemic. The Rose Gallagher series was on that list, and
I remember I was super jazzed by that because part of that book, that first book, was written in the New York Public Library, so that felt like kind of cool
the
stuff.
main branch.
Yeah.
I have ancestors who had a big hand in building that building.
Hmm.
A big a big firm based out of Massachusetts called the Norcross Brothers, and they also built the Low Library at Columbia University, which is the same era.
Okay.
I love that building. But what was interesting about this blog was all the books they recommended from you were hardly available at the library, and so it took a while for us to get I think there are just three books at this point in that particular series, to get them because we were reading them in ebook format. But I eventually, just so I could hold it up during the podcast, got a beaten up trade paperback from the library. It took a couple days, but we got it. But I love the way that you think about the paranormal, and how you talked a little bit, well, no, quite extensively actually, about it on another podcast that I just listened to. I'll put a link to it in the description for everybody, because I don't always remember the podcast names that I listened to, but it was a guy named David that you were talking to.
Geek's Guide to the Galaxy.
Yeah,
Hmm.
and I remember you were talking about the Fae and sort of an aversion to iron or something
Hmm.
like that. And I
Hmm.
remember that stuck with me because a short story that I published last year is about a dog and his boy, and how the dog would rescue pieces of the boy's soul. I hated growing up, so I kind of portrayed growing up as slices of the soul coming off a little bit at a time, and once you're out of your soul, you're an adult. And so this boy's dog rescues pieces of the boy's soul with the intent of giving it all back once he's an adult, and he's sort of rescued. But at one point in that story, I talk about how, well, you don't see fairies doing this because fairies haven't been around since the Industrial Revolution because of an allergy to iron. And I don't know why I thought of that, but I guess I must have read it somewhere years ago. But when you
Yeah.
brought it up, I'm just like, oh, so I didn't make that up. I must have read that.
It's amazing how many sort of pieces of ancient mythological lore get embedded in your subconscious without you necessarily realizing it. You come across it in all sorts of ways. And yeah, the aversion of fairies and the fae to iron goes all the way back, all the way back to yeah, I mean the age of the Picts and the Druids and all the rest of it. That's a central part of the lore, and so you see it come up a lot in a lot of different forms, particularly in paranormal romance. But you see it in, I don't know, like the Sookie Stackhouse books. You see it a lot of times. Vampire lore gets mixed up in there, so they also have, beyond the traditional garlic and stake to the heart and yada yada. There's an aversion to iron worked in there, probably related to the silver
Yeah.
bullet aversion. Do you want to call it that? The fatal effect a silver bullet will have on a werewolf. A lot of that kind of stuff. And I talked about it in the first book as well. What really fascinated me is when you start to dig into some of these mythological traditions, and particularly those that expand beyond the ones that we are maybe more familiar with, the Western European ones, the degree of overlap between them is almost spooky. The things that they have in common, particularly if you get past the nomenclature. You know, if you stop worrying about whether it's called a djinn or an elf or whatever, you start to see there's a lot of overlap between or an elemental or whatever. You start to see a lot of overlap between a lot of these traditions. So I think that's pretty cool. Like the ash tree, ashwood comes up in a lot of different traditions in a big way, and I find that interesting.
Yeah, I do too. And the moment you said jinn, immediately I thought of demon, and then you said elf, and I'm like, oh my god, yeah, elves would probably be kind of seen as the same thing. And
Yeah, elves were pretty like in original Norse mythology. Elves had a very different rep than they have these days. Let's put it that way.
you know,
They could be downright sinister. Certainly something to be feared.
yeah. Do you, out of curiosity, do you believe in ghosts?
So I don't know. It's not a very satisfying answer. I am one of these people that I would characterize myself as a true agnostic on many things. I'm pretty open minded about them until I've seen convincing empirical evidence that they do or do not
Mm.
exist. So I've certainly open to the idea that there are phenomena beyond our experience that we haven't got a scientific explanation for yet. Um, Whether they're ghosts in the way that we sort of conceive of them in popular culture is another question.
Yeah. See, the weird thing is, and this is something that I'm probably going to spend the rest of my life exploring, is I don't believe in ghosts, and I'm very much an atheist. But I love ghost stories, and I'm obsessed with them. And when somebody says, when I had Avi on, which it hasn't aired yet, so you can't research it, but I guess by the time this one goes up, you'll get access to it. But he was saying that he doesn't believe in ghosts, but he's seen a ghost, which is an interesting thing. And that's the I don't know why, like, how I don't believe in ghosts, but when somebody says they've seen a ghost, I can't help but want to believe them. You know?
Yeah. I mean, and a lot of times too, it comes down to the definitions that you're using and whether we're talking about the same thing. You know, if somebody asks you if you believe in God, they might be asking it in a very narrow sense, God as conceptualized in a particular piece of scripture, or they might be asking it in a broader sense of do you believe in a power beyond our ken?
Mm.
That might include, for example, some ancient alien race or something. People have sort of different, we're not always playing on the same field when we talk about some of these things. And so for me, there are a lot of things in hard science that are completely beyond my ken, like everything to do with quantum physics, all of it, the whole thing. I find that harder to believe and to understand and to connect with than I do the idea that some piece of us is eternal. Particularly if you buy into the whole idea that nothing that is can ever truly cease to be, which is kind of a central tenet of of physics, right? It
Yeah.
just it just changes into a different form. And so for me, I don't find it too much of a stretch to imagine that some piece of what we were is out there, but whether that piece has any meaning or retains any notion of self in a meaningful way, that's a different question.
Yeah. I'm working on a film on the post production of a film right now, and a lot of it has to do with the spookiness of quantum physics and the double slit experiment. And I just basically sent the visual effects guy a couple weeks ago. Actually, he's in London, and I emailed him some YouTube videos about sort of how I don't know if you know the term collapsing the wave function, and how they how they figured out that particles exist in two states until it's observed, at which point it chooses a state, which is
I mean, that's the
spoofed.
essence of quantum physics, right?
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
Schrodinger's cat.
It's
And
Schrodinger's cat.
I don't get it. I mean, I
It's
get it on some level. If a tree falls in the forest, blah blah. But fundamentally, but I also don't understand how a television works. So at a certain point, I just have to let it go. And I really do think that a lot of people treat matters of faith in that way. Like
yeah,
it almost, whatever function it serves in your life, it serves that function, whether it's a placebo or the real medicine, if I can use that analogy.
yeah. Just to get through life. Um, that's a good analogy. Have you ever heard of the term the Great Filter?
I don't think so.
So it's this idea that it's part of the full Fermi paradox thing where we don't see other spacefaring civilizations because there's supposedly a great filter that keeps species from being able to migrate into space. So hypothetically, we will end up destroying ourselves before we can become sort of a spacefaring civilization beyond our solar system. And they call it the Great Filter. And there's like a lot of theories about like what the specific filter is for any given civilization. And so I got to thinking last night about whether or not there's like a filter embedded in our universe that would ever keep us from really being able to use science to prove or disprove the paranormal. Like, is it even possible for science to do that? You know?
I mean, the idea of science proving or disproving the paranormal is a very old one, and the Victorians were certainly obsessed with it. And I mentioned in the author's note for Murder on Millionaires Row, and it still exists. You can still, get up one day and walk out there. The American Society for Psychical Research is now based in New York City. Used to be based in Boston. It's had an analog in London as well. And I mean, I would have loved to be a fly on the wall for those conversations because those societies initially, I can't speak for them now, but initially were made up of scientists who ran the gamut from hardcore believers to hardcore skeptics. Some of them were out to prove the phenomena, some of them were out to disprove the phenomena. And I imagine that made for interesting conversation over brandy. But they really, this was a big part of what they wanted to do. And you had people like Arthur Conan Doyle who were sort of sticking their necks out to say, I can't even remember the particular medium slash psychic that he was excited about, who was, I think, pretty roundly proven to be a hoax if memory serves. And Conan Doyle was having none of it, which is interesting considering his uber rational hero in Sherlock Holmes. I mean, Sherlock Holmes would have scoffed at the very notion, I think.
Yeah.
But
Well, that reminds me of something upstairs, which was main reason I had Avi on was in the beginning he says that the story is true, but he doesn't really say that. And one of the reasons I had him on is because I say, "Well, is the story true?" He says, "Well, the intro is true. The rest of the story isn't true." Isn't true at all, but it deliberately misleads the reader into thinking the ghost story is true. And I basically, but he said that he got a lot of letters from not just fans but from other publishers like, is this really true, did this really happen? And what I said was, we all want it to be true. Even the most rational people in the world kind of want it to be true because it makes all of the problems of their own lives much less significant than they feel. You know, no, like, to know that there's, to be able to get proof that there's another plane of existence would make me getting bills every day much, the bills wouldn't matter anymore. Like, and I think that Conan Doyle wanted that psychic to be real, regardless of the fact that he was probably a smart enough guy to know that it was bullshit.
Maybe. I mean, I know some very smart people who are people of faith who believe in God in the traditional sense, and
Right.
it's not a circle I can square.
Yeah.
But it doesn't. It comes down to where you place meaning, if I can put it that way. Like, if you're a particular bent, like I am, you could be completely fascinated by the fact that the most complex problems that we solve in our subconscious brain. A fact which has been, researched quite a lot and has been demonstrated to be so. That, regardless of how smart we are or aren't or how we were raised, our complex problem solving is largely a function of the subconscious to a part of the brain that you can't, by definition, consciously access. How different is that really from the idea that there are layers of meaning beyond our perception? There are within our own brains. So, why is it so difficult to imagine that this organ that we barely understand, that is performing functions that are complex enough to, I mean, we're still stumped by phenomena like people being in some sort of having some sort of traumatic experience that unlocks an ability that makes no sense, like the ability to draw an entire city from memory. And there are, of course, people, lots of examples of people with autism, for example, or other forms of different cognitive pathways that can do things that most of us can't even fathom. And sometimes it literally happens because they got in a bike accident where they were struck by lightning. That makes no sense. That to me suggests that there's just so much going on that we barely grasp. So if you accept that to be true, to me, then it's only an exercise in intellectual humility to acknowledge that there's all sorts of possibilities that might seem bizarre. That's because they haven't been meticulously cataloged doesn't mean they aren't out there.
Yeah. Have you ever watched that show Unsolved Mysteries? It's
I'm
from
going to
like the
date
90s.
myself here, but like I remember the original Jack Palance version. I
I didn't
used to
know there was
watch
a
it when
Jack.
I was a babysitter.
Oh, wow. I didn't know that he had hosted it. I only know the
He
Robert
is
Stack one.
way back in the day. I think so, anyways. I remember the Robert Stack one as well, but I'm pretty sure Jack Palance had. I might be conflating it with a different show. Now you're making me doubt myself.
I'm gonna
Pretty
look it
sure
up
though.
and I'll confirm it in in the description.
At any rate, yes. I mean, it
Yeah,
exists again. I've never
yeah,
seen it,
on
but
Netflix.
there's a reboot. I don't know if it's any good.
It's a different vibe. They're like hour-long documentaries on like one story rather than a collection of a few. But the reason I bring it up is because they had some really good accounts of somebody being struck by lightning and suddenly being able to have a gift of some kind, or a curse, and I mean more than a good helping of stories in that regard.
Yeah,
So
I mean, there's loads of examples, and loads of examples of things that we can't explain that have been well documented. So, I mean, if the mechanism behind them hasn't been worked out yet, well, that doesn't trouble me too much because there's a hell of a lot we haven't worked out.
yeah,
Like a lot. Starting from the very micro of our own bodies to the very macro of the mysteries of the universe.
how do you weight? You you clearly think a lot about these paranormal ideas, but you also do an enormous amount of historical research. So I was curious how you weight the two. Like, what actually gets pen to paper with you? Is it the research, or is it these thinking about these paranormal ideas, or is it the actual fictional characters? Because with me, I haven't figured out what the thing is that actually gets pen to paper. I know that I think about these things for many years before I ever write them.
I mean, I think for me it depends. It's different from one project to the next. I wouldn't say that I sit around cogitating on matters of the paranormal,
Yeah.
and I wouldn't say that the the dividing line is all that clear either. To use the concrete example of Murder on Millionaires Row, I had a concept which was really just a historical spin on what is a fairly well-chewed concept, which is the idea of a law enforcement agency of some type that investigates the paranormal. I mean, this is not new. There's a million examples of it, from Men in Black to X-Men. Okay, let's get off the aliens. What about Ben Aronovich's Rivers London, his Peter Grant series? Like, there's lots of examples of sort of permutations and combinations adjacent to that. And I wanted to do an upstairs, downstairs historical take on that. And so Pinkertons were the logical choice. So, I mean, the concept writ large was there. But then when it came time to figure out what's the setting, and, you know, what are the paranormal doings, then I turned to the New York Times. And so the ghost stories that is built off of are actual ghost stories as recounted in the New York Times. And I append some excerpts from the articles in question at the end of the book. So, you know, is that historical research, or is that thinking about the paranormal? Yes, it's, you know, all of the above. And for me, it was just a question of looking for, I don't know if you're familiar with The Terror, either the book or was it AMC? FX? I don't remember. One of them. Anyways, I highly recommend it, by the way, as the show. I haven't read the book. I understand it's a zillion pages. But the show, The Terror, is about the HMS Terror. Somebody actually named a ship that, I guess. Maybe it was supposed to be a warship. We talked about that on Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. You can listen to us chew on that for an hour and a half. But anyway, the Terror, which this is a real ship, was really lost in the Arctic with all hands, trying to find the Northern Passage. And so this is both a faithful recounting of some aspects of that voyage, but with a supernatural take on it. And this is very similar to the approach that I took for Murder on Millionaires Row. I deliberately set out to look for, and there are a million examples to choose from, especially in New York City, a weird historical happening, something that was either unexplained or that sort of lent itself to a retelling from a different angle. And I chose the explosion in Hellgate because, despite having lived in New York for a decade, I was not aware that Hellgate was a thing, because I do not go north of, I don't know, 80th Street or so very often, I will admit. Yeah, so I never sort of, you know, if you live in Astoria, you probably know, but there is that passage of water, and there's a bridge over it that until recently was known as the Hellgate Bridge. They renamed it. I don't remember what they renamed it to. Hellgate is that's low-hanging fruit. That's Buffy the Vampire Slayer stuff right there. So I just, you know, started researching that location and came across this explosion, which was the largest conventional explosion they reckon ever detonated, right up, the largest conventional explosion ever detonated up to a certain point, the largest explosion period until they started testing for the atomic bomb. And I mean, that just, to me, you had a huge explosion in a place called Hellgate, done and done. That's a great spot to jump off from. So it was really just kind of looking at what are the pieces of history that are interesting, and I've been doing that ever since. So for the second book, the jumping off point is just honestly a little indulgent, but it's the mayoral race of Theodore Roosevelt in 1886, because Theodore Roosevelt is fascinating. And then for the third one, well, anyways, I don't want to jump too far ahead, but suffice it to say that every time I put pen to paper, as you put it, I'm confronted with a blinking cursor. All it takes is a little Googling, and New York coughs up something excellent. So, I think any sort of storied city or old city will do that, which is, I think, maybe why you see more, as tempting as it is to set a historical novel someplace that nobody else has touched. It's often the case that if you want to be very faithful to historical detail, you're setting yourself up for a serious challenge, because none of that is really recorded.
Yeah, I encounter that sometimes when I'm writing about my hometown. I grew up on an island off the coast of Maine, which, in every inconceivable way, is haunted by history. It has
I'm suddenly
legacy.
thinking of the lighthouse.
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. The vibe of that thing is it's spot on. Um, but the island I grew up on, it's about the size of Central Park. It's in the middle of nowhere. It goes all the way back to pre-colonial days. There's supposedly record of the Abenaki tribe using that island in the summers. And the weird thing is, though, during World War II, it was a secret fuel depot for the North Atlantic Fleet. And there are these mounds in the middle of the island, which you're not allowed to dig up. And they're the old oil tanks that the Navy has basically said you're not allowed to remove them. And because of the whole center of the island is off limits essentially, the whole place vibes in a really creepy way. But it's really hard to get information about what it was like when they were dynamiting that island to install those tanks, and who exactly was on the island, who lived in that area, who had their houses taken from them, like all these really important details. There's like no records. I couldn't find records anywhere. I went to historical societies, hit up the DoD.
Have you tried newspapers?
Th-
Newspapers are great.
Yeah, I'm gonna have to. See, this is the thing is I'm gonna have to wait till after the pandemic to hit up newspapers because I think I have to go to the Portland Public Library to do that.
Maybe check out newspapers.com. Public
Newspaper.
service announcement. Um, some of their archives are free, and some of them are you have to subscribe. But they've done a really great job of. I actually use them even for the New York Times because although the Times has all of that stuff digitized, it's not very searchable. And what's remarkable, and I don't know the software that they've used to do it, but what's remarkable about the newspapers.com site is that even long defunct newspapers, they have scanned the page, so you still get the original font and the pictures and all of that, but somehow it's searchable. Now it's not perfect. The search function will make mistakes. It will misread a word. But you can type in a date range of a particular paper, and you can actually scan down to the word within articles.
Oh wow,
So, I mean, that's one of the ways that
it's a secret.
it's a secret. And so one of the fun things when you write historical fiction, it happens any kind of fiction that you write, but it's particularly historical fiction is particularly prone to this, to a bunch of people who think. Let me step back for a second. There's a difference between what is true and what seems to be true. And one of the things you're confronted with as a writer is sometimes you have to make a choice between those two things because what is true might to the casual reader seem so implausible that it pulls them out of the story. Um, and I remember having a conversation with my agent about a book I wrote some years ago in which the characters are caught in an avalanche. And he says, "Well, that seems very unlikely, doesn't it?" And I was like, "Not at all." Because, and I grew up in the mountains, so I proceed to explain about melting snowpack and the particular times of year and the particular places where you're most vulnerable to being caught in an avalanche, which results in actually this happens all the time. And he just made a face and he's like, "Yeah, I don't care though," because the reaction is what counts. And it's true that there is sometimes this difference between what seems true and what is true. So I'm just laying that as the context for what I'm about to say. People who consume popular media, whether it be genre fiction books like I write, or we watch Netflix or we go to movies, we sometimes develop the hubris that we know something about the period because we saw it on Netflix, which results in this really irritating phenomenon where people start trying to call you out on things you got wrong, but you definitely didn't get wrong. Anyway, newspapers are my kind of go-to thing for when I had back and forth with during the copy editing process about the use of words. Nobody used the word dementia back then. Want to bet? I refer you to this article in the New York Tribune. That this is how they used the word dude. This is how they used the word dementia. This is how, and newspapers are a really great way of doing that, because I kind of think they're really underrated as a primary resource for writing historical fiction. And I also highly recommend the advertisements in the back. If you want to get a sense of what the technologies were and, the clothes that people were wearing and all the sorts of things like that, just obsessing over an entire page of laundry soap ads, it gives you a really clear idea of what it was like to do laundry in 1884, which, depending on the type of book you're writing, might be a thing, especially if you're writing mysteries. Those little details about what you're going to encounter in your physical environment can be what your whole mystery turns on. That they used a particular brand of soap, and this is the only brand of soap that has this smell. I'm just throwing out a random example, but you know what I'm saying? Like, just newspapers all the way.
Have you ever explored or thought about ways to teach your readers on how to accept your research at face value? So
No.
one of the things I'm thinking of when you're talking about dude and other words is everybody has their own idea of space. So in every space movie, there's always an exposition moment where they have to explain the rules of the space of that particular movie.
It's like time travel movies. Let's stop a moment to discuss the nature of time.
And I'm just thinking, I think we might have to figure out a solution for history now, because everybody has their own idea about what history looks like, because there's just so much period content out there, and it's all just a little bit different.
But unlike a speculative fiction or science fiction, where science fiction as a subset of speculative fiction, science fiction or fantasy, where the writer has the obligation and the freedom to set the rules, and then your only obligation after that is fidelity to the rules that you yourself have established. Historical fiction is not a question of opinion. I mean, lots of history is a question of your particular angle on it, and there are lots of items that are disputed. But certain things, like whether a word was used prior to a certain year, if I can prove that it was, it's not really a matter of opinion at that stage. But that being said, I mean, I think one of the hardest / most illuminating things that I learned when I went from being an amateur author to a professional author whose work was out there for strangers was that I always thought of storytelling as a very unidirectional phenomenon. I am telling a story to you, and you are listening to the story. But that's not really how storytelling works. Storytelling is an alchemical reaction between what I said and what you heard. And what you heard is framed by your own life experiences and your own biases and your own education and a million other things. And that framework is rigid. It is not a thing that I can influence. It is a filter through which my story travels. And it is a fool's errand to treat it as anything other than that. So I put it out there. I say what I say. What you hear is your half of the equation, and it is not for me to influence. So, we can have sort of meta conversations about the ways one should and shouldn't interpret fiction. And we have those conversations all the time on Geek's Guide to the Galaxy in one way or another, where we talk about, types of storytelling or the way that we think about female characters versus male characters, or the way we think about the hero and what makes a hero, and all those sorts of abstract conversations you can have. But when it comes to the individual level and how you experience the story, I cannot and should not influence that as the author, is my view of it.
God,
That conversation is a I don't know, it's a unicorn. Each one is different. Everybody experiences the art differently, and that's part of what makes it beautiful. And sometimes it's super annoying, but that's just out of your control. So, as frustrating as it is, like any day of the week, I would much prefer a 1-star review that says, I hated this book, it was annoying, and that's it, to a long diatribe full of factual errors. That drives me crazy because the temptation to respond is almost overwhelming. You just want to be like, crack you a book that isn't fiction and come back to me. Take a moment to Google. Like, in the time that it took you to write this diatribe, you could have actually gone on the internets and realized you're wrong.
well, their
But no,
worldview was threatened.
but fake news it up, whatever.
Yeah, that sort of reminds me of the winners of history get to dictate their version of history, and people don't want that challenged. They don't
When
want
it
their
comes to
ideas of the
framing of
world.
events, for sure.
Yeah. I mean, we could have very well lost World War II and ended up being tried for human war crimes too, you know?
Yeah, indeed.
I was thinking you have some really int- good, dense, populated universes you've created, and I was just wanted to get your thoughts on, I guess, the advantages and disadvantages of writing in a universe, or if you have these stories, are you are you thinking about them for a specific universe, or do you have these story and you're like, well, I don't know if it would belong, but maybe I'll develop it for a Rose Gallagher universe or what have you. What is your approach on this?
I am not sure I totally know what you mean, but I think my answer is probably it depends.
Mm.
The Rose Gallagher series is a particular beast in that it's the process always begins with a real world event, and the stories are developed organically out of those. So it's different from, for example, the fantasy book that I'm writing right now, that it starts with a concept and the world is built around that, if you see what I mean.
Yeah.
It's these stories they start with something real and then everything flows out of that, as opposed to me saying to myself, it'd be really cool, a story about a girl who discovers a body in her basement and blah blah blah. Like, it doesn't work like that with that particular series. For other books, like my fantasy series or the one that I'm working on right now, that conversation kind of can take place depending on if you've been doing world building in the back of your head, whether you realize it or not, which, if you write speculative fiction, is something that is kind of often happening in the back of your mind if you're not really aware of it. So, the book that I'm working on right now, in terms of the world building ideas, I've been working on them for years now. But every time I've sat down to try to write the thing, it hasn't inspired me. It hasn't worked. It wasn't right. And the analogy that I've used to sort of describe that is, I had this really nice chassis, very shiny race car, but I couldn't find the right engine. And sometimes you have to, and the engine is the character and the heart, the beating heart of the story, for me anyway, is always the character. The plot and the world building are great, but if you can't really invest in the characters and in the emotions and in their personal struggles, then it never really resonates on the same level. And I tried a bunch of different engines in this car before I found the right one. And that's not something that's happened to me before. Before, I've always been fairly clear from the earliest conceptual stages that I wanted a particular type of hero or heroine of a particular age, and you know, had a rough idea of the voice that I wanted to use. I've never had so much trouble finding the right engine. But the flip side of that seems to be that when I found the right engine, the damn thing really goes. So I think the learning from that for me is that maybe not to paint myself into a corner too early, to be more open to experimenting with different voices and different age groups for your target audience and things like that, and seeing which really puts the wind in your sails. Just to mix the shit out of my metaphors.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it was I started with what I realized was a bad question, but you actually found your way to actually telling me what I was looking for. So it worked out. It worked out in the end, despite the fact that I was kind of projecting a process that didn't exist. And
Well, it might exist for some people in some type
yeah,
of story, right? And people ask writers about process a lot, and I've been doing this long enough to realize that, for me anyway, process is not written in stone.
yeah,
It's not only does it evolve in a sort of linear sense, it depends a lot on the type of project you're working on.
yeah, big time. That's one of the things that I felt like my peers years ago in my MFA program. I mean, it wasn't that long ago. It was in my mid 30s. Um, they wanted. They always seemed to want a definable, accessible, obvious process. And every visiting lecture we had it was always different for every single person. And some of these guys couldn't access that. They couldn't understand that. Like, why isn't it a mechanical process to create a book? And it baffled me that there's an abnormally high number of people in the writing programs that want it to be a more obvious
A
step by
recipe.
step. Yeah, a recipe. That's a perfect word for it.
Yeah, but you know what's funny about that is there is no recipe, but there is one ingredient. You have to write the damn thing. And the thing that really astonishes me is how many people are just kind of sitting around waiting for lightning to strike. Doesn't work that way. Never works
Yeah,
that way. No matter how strong your inspiration is, if you don't start fiddling with it and giving yourself the freedom to write stuff that sucks and delete it,
yeah,
if you don't actually put in the hours and do the thing and find time to write and make space to write, no matter how busy you are, no matter if you're typing it through on your iPhone while you're sitting on the subway. And I know New York Times bestselling authors that have written their books that way. I'm not kidding. You, if you don't write, it's not going to get written.
yeah.
And I know that sounds trite, but if you know any aspiring authors, a lot of them just aren't writing.
Well, let me tell you, this is a mixed media podcast. So I interview artists and creators of all medias, but April is National Poetry Month, so I've been actively interviewing writers just to feature all writers in April, and every single one of them, the most successful ones, say the same thing: don't wait for it to start writing. Don't wait for lightning to strike. Just start writing. And even the ones who there was I think I'm starting with a woman who she just released her first published book. She's new to the game, and she's a firm believer that you shouldn't go through a creative writing MFA program and not come out with your first book, no matter what. And that sort of alludes to it too. Like, just write it. And
Well, and maybe your first book isn't a doorstopper, but you should be able to come out of an MFA program with an idea about what makes a story.
yeah,
And my big Achilles heel as a writer is it's my Achilles heel in life. I am extremely distractible in the sense that I can't seem to settle on a genre or a tone or anything else. I'm all over the place.
but I think that's what
That's a
makes your
lot of
work
fun.
interesting
It's a
because
lot of fun, but it does drive, I'll tell you, it drives the marketing department pretty damn crazy. because, how do you market something like Murder on Millionaires Row, which, by the way, was not, you will have heard me mention this probably to Dave on the Geek's Guide to the Galaxy podcast, was not its original title. None of those books are rocking their original titles. Those cover treatments are designed to sell to a particular type of audience. The titles are chosen to sell to a particular type of audience that the publisher has deemed to be the right audience for those books.
How
They're
would you
not the
describe
audience I had in mind for the books.
how would you describe your current audience versus the one that you thought that you were going to have?
I don't know that I can answer that question. When somebody writes to you, they don't tell you, unless you're creeping their Goodreads pages and seeing what else they're reading. It's not really evident what type of reader they are or how they came to you. So I don't know that I can answer the question. I would assume that the majority of them are historical mystery readers. I would assume that because that is the marketing campaign behind it. And most people will have seen the books because of where they're shelved at Barnes and Noble, or where they're shelved at the library, or what book groups are talking about it. That's how word of mouth spreads. That being said, the most enthusiastic social media response that I've received has always been from the fantasy community, which does not surprise me because that is the community for whom the book was conceptualized.
That's a very hungry community too.
Indeed.
Um,
and a frothy community when they like something. So that's always been a source of I think confusion for everyone concerned, because most publishers, even the biggest publishers, when you get down to the level of the imprint, they have a particular audience that they work with. They have a particular sales force that they work with. If they have a particular network for word of mouth that they work with, and they're not really very good at going beyond those boundaries. So if you sell your fantasy book to a mystery publisher, you should fully expect that it's going to be marketed as a mystery. And, go in eyes open on that. So for me, that's always been a challenge because I have not written in the same genre twice. So I start from scratch every time, and it drives the marketers crazy.
I think it's your strength though, because I find that the best, most versatile writers, at least in my taste, tend to be interested in all of these subject matters that you're clearly tackling, and I'm always game for giving the marketing department a run for their money. Like earn your keep.
Yes, but don't be surprised if you stumble. And so that's kind of where I'm at right now, is I think that, first of all, I don't think I could do it any other way, even if I tried, because I've learned the hard way. We were talking earlier about this. I've learned the hard way that if I'm not really jazzed about it, I can't really produce at the level that I want. So I can't pretend to be jazzed about something I'm not. And so I have to write what interests me, and what interests me seems to always fall between the cracks. It's never fish or fowl, ever. It's always somewhere in between. So part of it is just accepting reality. Part of it too is I'm going to say when and not if, when my audience really finds me, there's no question that my work is original, because it is neither fish nor fowl. But it does make it harder for the audience to find you, because particularly in this day of the overwhelming algorithm, where Amazon and Goodreads and everything tells you what to read based on what you've read previously, it drives all of us into boxes. And reading things that don't fall neatly into either of those boxes, you have to actively go looking for that. And not everybody, reasonably enough, not everybody is willing to go out looking for the different thing. It's just much easier to pick up what's right in front of your face. So that's been the challenge for me so far. And I choose to believe that when it happens, it'll really happen, because there really isn't anything else out there quite like what this series is, for example. It is very different. And that's both its strength, but it's also its Achilles heel, because it makes it much more difficult. I mean, you've seen the way when they're advertising, this as a filmmaker, when you're advertising something, the very first thing that they go for is, it's like this other thing. Yeah. They go for the comps, right?
Yeah.
There are no comps. There just aren't. The closest you can come up with is it's like if this thing was wedded to that thing. It's like X-Files meets the Murdoch mysteries. Okay, what? Something like that. And so that I think that's difficult. Excuse me.
Once you're once you really realized your audience, though, you'll be the comp.
Be the comp. That should be a
Yes.
shirt.
Yeah, yeah, that's a great one. Um, well, when I don't know if you have a merchandise section of your website, but there you go.
No.
Have you? We'll wrap this up soon. We're approaching the hour mark. I don't want to waste too much of your time, but I saw that you spent some time in Vancouver.
Hmm.
I did too. I went to film school there.
Okay.
I always thought that was had an interesting history and kind of an interesting geological history too. Have you ever thought about really rooting a franchise there?
I haven't. I am still kicking around the idea of writing a book set in my hometown in the 19th century because this was like such a Wild West town, which is Calgary, by the way, in
Yeah.
case anyone is curious. But no, I can't say it's ever really occurred to me. Um, I have lived all over the world, and there are lots of places that interest me that I could potentially write about. But I do think that you have to have a certain level of innate excitement about the place and its history to write about it. And certainly I mean, I was a New Yorker from the day that I moved there. It's like sinking into a hot bath. It's like hell yeah.
I know that feeling.
um, and I've not really had that love affair with anywhere else that I've lived, even the places that I really quite liked. I certainly, I must confess, did not have that love affair with Vancouver at all. I enjoyed it when I first moved there. It was the first I first left the nest. It was the first place I'd lived that wasn't home. But I come from a place that's sunny 350 plus days a year, and I found it very difficult. The weather very difficult. I never did get over it, to be honest.
All right. So it's a
It's
fair and honest answer,
too
and
damn wet.
it also tracks with some of my experiences there as well. But I still I think that Vancouver suffers a great deal from not having a solid identity. It's always used as a backdrop for someplace else, and
I mean, in film, certainly.
yeah,
But that's true of Canadian cities
yeah.
in general. But what I really appreciate is you can always tell when something is filmed in Vancouver because it's always cloudy.
And the mountains, and then
Always.
yeah, and I've also had an interest in seeing Quebec more in stories, but whatever, we'll get there eventually.
Excuse me.
Yeah, it's okay.
Yeah, I think you have to be from. I mean, I think to do justice to some of those places, like you were talking about the island where you grew up, I don't think you can write the shipping news unless you come from the East Coast. You know what I mean? You
Yeah,
really have to understand the deep and heavy misery of that sea. That salt has to seep into the marrow of your bones. And you can sort of see that from a distance and try to imagine it. But I just think if you didn't grow up with the keening cry of gulls in your ears, you're never going to be able to sort of project that. And I just don't think that I could write about New York the way that I do without having lived there for a long time. Maybe that's wrong, but and it's
no,
kind of peculiar for me to say that as a fantasy author because of course I write about places that don't even exist. But then
but
there's no one that can tell you you're wrong.
yeah. Well, the thing is there's a reason that these completely made up stories are accessible and that they're rooted in sort of a passion for the place where you've decided to set it, some level of history that you've decided is some sort of spark to this. I guess depending on what it is in the element, but I mean, I've tried to write about places I've never even visited, and there's just no passion. I mean, I gave that up years ago, but no, I totally get what you're saying. It makes total sense. I was just curious because I am rooting for sort of more content from Canada that's actually about Canada and not about other places.
I think there's lots of Canadian content about Canada. I think if you're a Canadian author and you have any business sense, you will write about Canada because then you will be featured in Canadian newspapers and on the CBC, and you will get funding from the Canada Council for the Arts.
Yeah.
Just to be a complete cynic about it, I think and you know what? If you're into that kind of thing, oh shoot, what's her name? We're gonna go for a walk. Are you ready?
Okay.
We're going for a walk.
All right.
I just started reading a mystery series by a Canadian author that is set in BC. Well, sorry.
Oh, nice. Yeah, that's a haunted place.
And it's historical mystery set in. It's been a few months since I read it. I want to say the 50s. Stand by. Iona Wishaw.
How do you spell the last
Anyways,
name?
the Lane Winslow Mysteries. Her last
Lane
name is
Winslow.
Whishaw.
I'll check that out, and I'll also link to it in the description. Before we go, can I tell you a spooky thing that happened to me in BC?
Please.
Okay, so I spent a year there taking a film course, and outside of the sort of main peninsula of Vancouver, I had no idea about like where I was whenever I had to leave, and we were doing a film shoot at somebody's house way in the boonies, and I had panicked because
Like the boonies like Coquitlam or the boonies like north of Prince George?
no skyscrapers. I don't know. It was like just regular houses. I mean, we're talking
No offense if you are from either of those
yeah,
locations.
cul-de-sacs. Yeah, I don't know what any of these places were called outside of the city, but
But you were
it was just
still like in the greater metropolitan area.
probably, but I didn't
Okay.
know that because I had no idea where I was. I was really, really young. I think I was like 19, and I'd never left Maine before. And all my rides back to the city had gone off to like various places, and I was stuck in the middle of nowhere without a way of getting back. And it was dark. It was like 1 a.m. All the houses in the area had gone dark. And I was pacing back and forth for like 2 hours until somebody thought to come back and pick me up, my initial ride. So I get home, I go to sleep, and I wake up around 11 a.m. in the morning with a message from my mom on it was a regular answering machine back then because it was about 2001. So I didn't have a cell phone. And I press play on the answering machine, and my mom goes, "Eric, I woke up in a cold sweat last night. I had a really bad dream that you were stranded out there in the darkness. Give me a call. Let me know you're all right." I'm like, what? That is so creepy.
Freaky. I
So
have so many of those. Like the time that my brother and my sister independently on separate days saw a phantom person in their room in South Africa with like there was no conversation between them about it.
Yeah,
Freaky.
I love that stuff. It's so freaky. Anyway, I'll let you go. I'll let you get back to writing. Thank you. Have a good night.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.
And that was my discussion with Erin Lindsay. I reached out to her after I had done the Avi podcast because we'd initially touched upon the idea of ghost stories and why people like ghost stories, even people like me who don't believe in ghosts. And then I got to thinking, who else could I talk to about the paranormal and ghost stories? And so Erin Lindsay came to mind because I love the way she deals with the paranormal in these stories. The Rose Gallagher series specifically. And so if you're interested, there are links in the description to her work. Thank you, Erin, for coming on, and I hope to have you back. And thank you all for listening. I hope to have you back, and see you on the next one. Hey, everyone. Thanks for visiting my YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that bell notification.